Hey everyone, and on today's show we're going to be looking at one of the biggest what if questions of all time, and I know one that so many Bond fans like yourself have wondered yourself and just thought about. But the question today is, what if Sean Connery starred in Casino Royale? And that video is happening right now. I feel like most James Bond fans out there, this thought has certainly gone in your head once or twice in your life. It was like, what if the Bond series had started in 1962 with Casino Royale, the first James Bond novel, and it also had Sean Connery in the role as James Bond? To be honest, I think the mind boggles. It really is such a tantalizing thought about a possible what if, how different could it have been, what would of that film been like, how would it have been received, who would have starred in the role. There's so many what ifs in this. I feel such a tantalizing idea and concept that I feel every Bond fan has his own thought and opinion on this. To be fair, it took me a while to do this video, and the reason is because I kept coming up with so many different scenarios of what if this and what if that, but the more I sort of looked into it, the more I thought about it, the more exciting I got about it, and this whole version of it which I really want to present to you right now. So this video is going to look into that what if Casino Royale starring Sean Connery, and we're going to get into that in a moment. But before we get into that, everyone, can I just ask everybody, do give us a like, comment and subscribe to the channel. We're trying to get as many new views as we can on the channel, so if you can help us, that would be absolutely amazing. So I've done the introduction, you know what this episode's about. I'm sure you're getting hyped about what the possibilities here. Let's dive into it right now. If Sean Connery had starred as James Bond in Casino Royale, and it was the first film in the Bond franchise, it would have likely had a significant impact on the trajectory of both the character and the series as a whole. I think one of the good things about the Bond franchise is the fact that you did start off with Dr. No, which is a real sort of middling level Bond film where it's a bit of the original style of Fleming writing and more of the newer fantastical Ian Fleming writing. So it was actually a really good one to start on, but as I mentioned just there, the tone would have been so different. Sean Connery's portrayal as James Bond is known for his suave sophistication and charisma, as well as being, if you don't mind me saying, quite physically fit. In Casino Royale being the first film and Connery role, it would have had set the specific tone and style of the series, which will have influenced other Bond actors and films later down the line. Just imagine this, if you will, Terence Young and Sean Connery together making Casino Royale in the 1960s. I think potentially the tone would have been even darker than what we actually got in the film Dr. No. I think it would have been a much more serious and much more sort of psychological Bond film than I think we've actually even had to this day. If we compare it to the Casino Royale that we got, let's be fair, yes, the second half is the novel adapted for a modern day audience, but I feel like if Terence Young and Sean Connery were making it together and at that time period, we could have had quintessentially the most psychological spy thriller that ever actually existed. Sean Connery is widely regarded as one of the most iconic actors in the world, and certainly for his portrayal of James Bond. If he had debuted in Casino Royale, it would have set an extremely high bar for future Bond actors to live up to. Connery's portrayal would have become the benchmark for what fans expected from the character. Do you know what? I think it's really fair to say this, and maybe it's a bit unfair, but Connery is basically the definitive James Bond. That I think is well established between like normal audiences, maybe hardcore James Bond audiences. We all have our favourites. Heck, my favourite James Bond is Pierce Brosnan. He always will be, and he always will be my James Bond. But Sean Connery was James Bond, and I feel if you had given him the Casino Royale material when he really cared about the role as well, I can't help but feel maybe it was a benchmark that no other actor, no matter who you got, could have lived up to. Heck, I even feel like this. Daniel Day-Lewis is probably the greatest actor of all time, and if he had started James Bond, even after a Sean Connery Casino Royale, nothing would have just lived up to. He couldn't have competed with Sean Connery Casino Royale, in my opinion. Casino Royale is a pivotal story in the James Bond franchise because it explores the early days of Bond's career and how he becomes the character we all know and love. If Connery had starred in this film, it would have presented a different take on Bond's origin and character development to the later films explored in his backstory. Again, I think seeing Sean Connery become James Bond in this film would have just been absolutely incredible. And also, I mentioned just there, it sets up this precedent because one of the things that was done in the Craig era was because you had Casino Royale, you were allowed to show, if you will, the Bond's origin and someone becoming James Bond and show a more psychological, as I mentioned earlier, and more character-driven story that we hadn't really seen at that point for the character. And if they had started with it right there at the beginning in the 60s, again, what an incredible opening movie, and maybe one that you could have never truly beaten in quality and what it does for character development. I would have loved to have seen Sean Connery become James Bond in a 60s version of Casino Royale, because I feel it would have done so much subcontextuously that, you know, not even the Casino Royale of Craig did. It really did bring it up a bit more, but I think it would have been so much more subconsciously done, and so not really said but really shown in that Terence Young James Bond style. It's just, again, the mind boggles at what potentially could have been. The James Bond franchise has had a significant influence on the spy genre. Heck, it probably has been effectively for a while the spy genre. If Connery's portrayal had defined the character, and with the material with Casino Royale, it would have set a very different standard for spy movies from the 1960s onwards, influencing other spy franchises and maybe some finding that they just can't compete with this one film. I do feel that this film would have been like the holy grail of spy movies. For the record, everyone, for me, the holy grail of spy movies, the definitive spy film at the moment in our existence, is actually the Bond film From Russia with Love. But again, I feel this one would have just had such a massive impact going in through different generations and definitions, where people will watch this film, they will study it, they will look at it, and this would be like a real big opener to the spy genre franchise of what it actually could potentially be, what it could do. I think the real connection and the best similarity I can come up with at my moment is The Dark Knight. The Dark Knight was an influential movie, and it really showed what superhero movies could be. And I feel Casino Royale would have had the exact same zeitgeist that The Dark Knight had back in 2008. Now, I'm not saying that Dr. No in our existence didn't do that, quite far from it. It showed a new style of hero, a different sort of world of the spy genre, and it did open, and it was on the edge, it was dark, it was broody for the time. But again, imagine having that sort of gut punch of a whole new direction which you could take the spy genre and characters with the material of Casino Royale at the time. Okay, so one thing I'm pretty sure you're all thinking about is, if this film was made in the 60s, what would have happened with this? Now, obviously, I don't think this torture sequence that is very famous in the novel Casino Royale would have been done in any way like it was done in the books or in the later movie. Now, I do think they would have included some sort of torture sequence in there. I think that's a fair estimation, but I imagine it to be something more like a whole beat-up process. A constant barrage of being beaten up by some bad guys asking, where is that check? I do think one of the advantages of Casino Royale being made in our timeline and releasing in 2006 was the fact that audiences, I feel, were okay enough with a much more graphic, violent torture sequence, and something that really rivaled what happened actually in the books. I feel in the 1960s, audiences just would have been okay, that wouldn't have accepted it, and would have never done anything as bad as that. I think you can't deny that it would have had an impact on things like From Russia with Love and Goldfinger that would have followed afterwards. You can't hide from that. And I feel it would have cast an extremely large shadow of just pure brilliance. Maybe some other Bond films either could live up to the standard or just get near it, or potentially never ever reach it. So I think for part one of just looking at this what if for the things I mentioned, it would have been this mammoth and incredible film that would have probably gotten more love as the years went on and on and on. But I don't want to stop there with this what if, because I couldn't just stop there thinking about all these great things that could have done. I've got to look into potentially what the film could have looked like, what the film could have been, and who cast it. So this is really like part two of this what if, because I want to look into those things right off the bat. So first thing I think is, obviously, if you look at Dr. No, that will give us the best idea of what potentially the film could look like visually, stylishly, and you have to admit, with Terence Young directing Casino Royale, it would have been incredible. I think the Terence Young and Peter Hunt duo together, filming and editing, giving the style and sophistication to James Bond in that movie as the film progressed, would have been absolutely incredible. But I think one of the big things a lot of people would ask is how would that epic Baccarat poker scene looked in the 60s? And to be honest, I think it would have been absolutely incredible. I can imagine as well with Monty Norman and John Barry, the tension music in those hands between Bond and Le Chiffre would have been absolutely incredible. It would have, I think, really rivaled what we got actually in Daniel Craig's Casino Royale. It would have just been absolutely fantastic, and I feel the whole film would be a much more intellectual film. I'm not saying Dr. No wasn't intellectual, far from it, but I think there would have been a lot more of a sort of intellectual conversation and themes and like tensions and characterizations of characters. Just there's so many different directions the film could have gone in with those key people there starting off. I also just want to point out here that I feel very strongly this film would have been even more successful, if possible, than Dr. No. Dr. No was made on a good, modest budget, made a massive box office return. And I feel Casino Royale would have been done the same. They would have taken the novel and adapted as close as they did with the Dr. No book for the 1960s. And because of that, we would have got something truly incredible. Something really to rival things like Hitchcock's North by Northwest at the time. Maybe even surpass it, in my opinion. But the second half that I really want us to chat about, and I'm sort of going down a bit of a list here, is the potential casting. Let's be fair, obviously we wouldn't have had Joseph Wiseman as Dr. No or Le Chiffre here in this sort of universe, and I can't just help but think of all the different people they might have cast as Felix Leiter, maybe still Jack Law, but who would have played Rennie Mathis? Who would have played Vesper? Who would have played Le Chiffre? There's so many. So for the next bit here, I just want to go through some possible ideas of casting they could have done. So starting off with the character of Vesper Lynd, one of the most central characters in Casino Royale, her casting would have been critical for the first James Bond film here. And actresses I think who could have been considered would have actually been our Dr. No Honey Rider Ursula Andress. I think as well our Pussy Galore Honor Blackman, maybe in our Tracy Dinah Rigg, or even actress at the time, Julie Christie. Of all of those, I have to say, for me, I would have loved to have seen, actually, Dame Diana Rigg as Vesper Lynd. I think she would have been incredible. She was great as Tracy, but giving her that elevated prestigiousness of being Vesper Lynd, for me, would have definitely been an absolute winner. Sean Connery and Diana Rigg together. Just chef's kiss, mwah. Looking now at potentially the villain, Le Chiffre, we would require an actor to play a real menacing and sophisticated villain like he was in the book and in the movie, and for me there are some really great potential answers here, but for me I would like to go with the 1967 version actually of Casino Royale, with actually potentially Orson Welles, a bit of a younger Orson Welles playing Le Chiffre, and even Sir Christopher Lee. As we all know, Orson Welles is one of the greatest actors of all time, so I think maybe him in a bit more of his prime doing Le Chiffre would have been absolutely great and a great foil to go against Sean Connery's James Bond here. And just, oh my god, just imagine those two playing off each other in the first James Bond movie. How could you compete with Orson Welles as the first James Bond villain? And again, following on from that, we got our Christopher Lee, Man with the Golden Gun, you know, actually a relative to Ian Fleming. And can you imagine Le Chiffre played by Sir Christopher Lee? You know, really young, off his Hammer horror success, just, again, would have been absolutely incredible to watch. So, for me overall, I think the Casino Royale starring Sean Connery, if it was to happen, would have just been utterly incredible and utterly amazing. It would have been a treat to us Bond fans, and for me, of all the what ifs I've ever done, whether it being like George Lazenby in Diamonds Are Forever, Sean Connery on A Majesty's Secret Service, Dalton getting his third James Bond film, Brosnan doing a fifth Bond film, or whatever, this is the one. This is the one that really interests me, really excites me, and I wish we could go into a multiverse and actually see this version and what it could have been. This is the one that, you know, the big one, as Blofeld says. But I want to know, everyone, what are your thoughts on the idea of Sean Connery as James Bond Casino Royale? Do you like the idea? How do you feel it would have been different? What's your reaction to it? I want to know. Comment down below and tell me your thoughts and feelings about it, please. As everyone, as always, my name's Henry Stevens. I'm the Bond Geek. Goodbye.